Konrad, my friend. Here
Good
we
to
are,
see you again.
20 years later. We have come a long way toward our future in space, which is what we were examining then, and we are just a few days beyond that 63rd anniversary of the A4 launch in Germany, which I said was the real origin of vehicles in space. And a lot has happened since then, and we would like to explore with our audience some of the real problems and prospects that we have at this point in history. But before we do that, we want to go back a little bit in history. And as you think back over the project, what do you think we need to emphasize, and some of the points that we perhaps omitted? Could you give us some ideas about some of those early points that might not have really been covered too well in the tapes?
Of course, when we made those tapes, we had just started the Shuttle program, and everyone was really looking forward to a great program with a lot of science that could be done in orbit with the Shuttle. And of course, we have also done quite a bit of that. But shortly after we took our initial tapes here, we had the first big accident. And unfortunately, one of the SRBs had a problem. An O-ring was melted through, and the shuttle lost the explosive force through that hole, and that even burned up the tank, and we had a very bad explosion. And of course, we lost in the Challenger accident the entire crew at that time. And at that time, of course, I personally, and probably many of my compatriots, were a little bit surprised that this thing happened with the SRB. And the reason for the fact that it happened is that the SRBs are very heavy, and you cannot build them at a place like Thiokol in Utah and transport them, because they have to be transported by a truck or by railroad car. And for that reason, they had to be subdivided into individual segments. And even the segments are still pretty heavy, and they had to be shipped, of course, to the Cape, and then at the Cape they had to be assembled. And this assembly was a pretty tricky job, and that was a reason that between some of these elements, the seal with the O-ring didn't work properly, and that's why we had the accident. In the meantime, of course, that joint there with the O-ring has been redesigned, and in a way I'm very happy to say today that we had many, many launches since the time, close to 100 launches, and they all, the SRBs in all these launches performed perfectly. We had no further problem, so I think this problem has been solved. And to go a little bit ahead already in time, you probably know that the new idea is that NASA has to go back to the moon, use again an SRB as a first stage. It will be a little bit bigger than the present SRBs. We add another segment, and maybe that's one of the advantages of segmentations of the SRBs, individual elements. If you need somewhat more power, you just add another element. And of course, we still have to do some testing to be sure the nozzle and the protective material in the nozzle will take this extra heat. But I personally don't really expect too many problems in that area. And you also may have heard, for the final big launch vehicle to the moon, which will not only carry the astronauts but a lot of the heavy equipment, we use again two SRBs on the right and left hand side of the tank, and that will have another fuel element added to it. So again, you can easily increase the power of these SRBs, as it will be done for the return to the moon and the eventual trip into outer space. One of the shuttle problems that finally came up is the fact that the shuttle itself can only go into an Earth orbit. So in order to go back to the moon or to go into deep space, we have to carry by means of the shuttle a relatively heavy payload in an Earth orbit and then ignite normally SRBs at that time and use that extra power then to propel our payload into outer space or eventually go back to the moon, or there were also quite a number of Mars missions and missions to other planets in the meantime. But that is one of the big problems with the shuttle. It can only go into an Earth orbit. And for that reason, for almost the last 20 years, we have been tied to Earth orbit. We could, for major efforts, not do, particularly with people, very much above and beyond that. And for that reason, I'm very happy that President Bush, a little while ago, about 1.5 years ago, declared our intent that we really want to get out of Earth orbit and that we want to go back to the moon, and this time not only for a very short trip like we did with Apollo, but that we plan eventually to stay on the moon and that we eventually will have a permanent station on the moon. And the moon, of course, would only be basically a first step to a future trip to Mars. A trip to Mars is, of course, much, much more complicated if we don't come up with new propulsion systems, but if we have to use our presently existing chemical propulsion systems, it takes us almost a year, certainly more than half a year, to get to Mars, even at the time when the Mars is in the best position in relationship to the Earth. Of course, both planets rotate around the Sun, and they rotate with a different orbital time, and therefore they are only a relatively short time close to each other. At another time, the Earth is one side of the Earth, and Mars on the other side of the Earth, and that, of course, would call for a very, very long trip, a trip that probably would take several years. I don't think anyone has even made calculations how long that would take, because, of course, the present intent is to go to Mars when the Mars is in a favorable position to the Earth. After we have done our Mars exploration, then, of course, we have the same problem again for coming back. And probably when we are ready to come back, the Mars is at the wrong end of the Sun. So we have to wait on Mars for about a year before we are ready to come back. So to go to Mars is a very difficult, very demanding thing. First, it takes a long time, and we have not solved all the human problems, like bone decalcification and things like that, to sustain our astronauts for such a long time. And after they have been in space for at least half a year, probably closer to a year, they then have to land on Mars, and they don't have any assistance and any helpers there to help them out of their spacecraft and to help them to do what they are supposed to do to explore Mars. So that's another big problem. And besides the technical problems we probably discussed to a somewhat bigger degree here today, we also have to think of the human problems, but that is, of course, the responsibility of the Johnson Spacecraft Center in Houston. That's not our responsibility here. So I don't want to elaborate on that too much. I only would like to point out that that may be the biggest problem. That may be the high pole in the tent. And I personally am all in favor of learning on the moon what we eventually want to do while we explore Mars and while we have to stay on Mars for a relatively long time. It probably will still be always around about 1 year. So we have to prepare to support our crew from the very beginning for this long period on Mars. And we also, of course, have to be ready to bring the crew back at the time after they have done their Mars exploration. And there are some people who propose that on Mars, where we have a carbon dioxide-rich atmosphere, once we find water on Mars and can decompose it into hydrogen and oxygen, or if that is not the case, if we bring some hydrogen up to Mars, we can make our own return fuel on Mars, and even fuel to travel around with our exploration vehicles, with our Mars rovers, so to speak. If we plan to use methane, CH4, we need quite a bit of hydrogen, which is for sure very light, and it would not be too difficult to bring it to Mars. And of course we can get the carbon from the CO2 on Mars. So that would be one big thing, and I think that's also an area where we still should do quite a bit of work to really be eventually ready for a Mars trip. But what I understand, NASA does not even plan to go with people to Mars right now. They want to look into all these problems and probably other problems. They want to find out, if you go back to the moon, what are the problems with our new big launch vehicles? What does it really take to stay for longer periods on an isolated area like the moon? And after we have learned all these things and also solved all the other problems I touched on earlier, only then will we really make the detailed plans to go eventually to Mars. And I know that one of our interviewers here, Dr. Stödinger, is quite a bit concerned about the situation. He is of the firm opinion that today we are not ready to go to Mars. We have to learn a lot of things, we have to do a lot of additional research, and hopefully we can do that on the moon before we are really ready to go.
So you believe we should get firmly established, perhaps with a permanent or semi-permanent lunar base, before we really begin to start toward Mars, which could be late this century at the best, some people have said. Do you think that's a reasonable time frame?
I think we certainly should use an initial step on the moon to do all these things, to learn all the things we need to know in order to go to Mars. And I also personally, and I don't know if NASA agrees with me on this, we should really try to economically exploit the moon. And particularly astronaut Harrison Schmitt, makes a strong point that we have a lot of helium-3 on the moon. And if we can bring that helium-3 back, I have heard if we had about a space shuttle payload, if we could bring that much helium-3 back to Earth, we could then really on a big scale build future reactive systems. So we can use a helium-3 to build a non-critical reactor. And I personally think that might be even one big step ahead of going to Mars. And of course, if we could really build not radiation creating reactors down here on Earth, that would be a tremendous effort. And many of the problems we have right now with our carbon dioxide atmosphere would be taken care of if that could be done. And I think that's one thing that could be done. And I understand some of the early missions going back to the moon with unmanned payloads, with robotic type payloads, will also study if not even on the moon we find some remnants of water. And there are some indications that some water rests maybe on the pole. I think it is the south pole of the moon. And if that is the case, then of course we could use that water to even create on the moon our own propellants. We could disassociate the water into hydrogen and to oxygen, and that of course would be a tremendous advantage. Again, if that's also what we want to do on Mars, it would be nice if we could learn how to do it already on our early moon exploration trips.
Well, in a series of articles that were published in the Huntsville Times in the last weekend, I believe, several people, including Sherman Salzer, were quoted as saying, we really haven't defined why we want to go back to the moon, and we must do that. What is the essential purpose of going back to the moon? And personally, I've always felt that In this growing age of what I would call mega disasters, where we hear daily of so many huge tragedies that either have happened or may happen, it might be much better to have an interplanetary outpost on the moon as sort of a fallback, temporarily so maybe, for humanity. While things are getting together down here, the possibilities of global pandemics, the possibilities of asteroid strike of Earth, these are things that our life insurance policies would be much better if we were living permanently on the moon. Do you think that that is a reasonable goal for 21st century space science?
I think it is certainly one of the goals, and I think it is important that we work on these kind of problems. What do we do in order to protect the Earth? On the other hand, as I also pointed out, I personally think the moon is a very important intermediate step of going to Mars. Of course, you might ask the question, why do we want to go into space at all? I personally think man has always tried to explore. He always has tried to expand his horizons. In the early days of Columbus, to come here to the Americas, and even after that, we always have tried to find out what is beyond our presently existing horizon, even going underwater into the deep sea. That is a new exploration type effort. And I think the man always would want to do that. So I think, again, Mars is only a first step, and I think eventually we hope, at least I hope, we will go with man into the entire solar system. If we can go with our present knowledge, with our present technologies, beyond that, that is still somewhat doubtful. But I think with all the ingenuity we have in this country and around the world, we will eventually find ways and means of doing that. So I think eventually we might even be able to popularize, to build up with people the entire universe. But that, of course, is thousands of years away from now, and I think we too will have no chance to see that point.
I'm afraid you're correct.
On the other hand, I don't even remember if I ever mentioned to you when I got started to go into space in the late 1920s in Hanover, where we had our own amateur rocket society. Our goal was really at that time to go to Mars. After all, the moon is just a part of the Earth-Moon system. It is not a new planet, and we wanted to go to the next planet. And of course, I'm very, very happy that at least in my old days, I see an effort made that we finally do what I wanted to do all my life, all along, that we are finally on our way to Mars. So I think Sherman Seltzer is a little bit over-concerned. I think there are a lot of good reasons to go to the moon, and I even think there are plenty of good reasons to go beyond the moon to Mars and to other points in the universe, in the solar system in the beginning. So I personally am not that concerned, and I even think that the reasons that we want to go to the moon can be sold not only to the American public, but to the global public, to all the people in the world. And I think something that probably is even going to put a little bit more push behind the thought is the fact that the Chinese are well on their way to also go to the moon. And once that happens, then I think for competitive reasons alone, we also do not want to be left behind. So it's not only us here in the United States that we want to go to the moon, but other people are planning to do the same thing. I understand the Chinese have similar plans, and also the Russians have indicated that they would also really like to go beyond what they have been doing up to now, and also that they plan to go back to the moon. For them, not going back to the moon, but going the first time to the moon. Now, I personally, and maybe I'm a little biased in that area being from Germany, I'm of the opinion that these huge efforts should be a global effort, and that should we invite the Russians, where we have invited them to participate in the space station. We should really go back to the moon together with them. And I personally am a little bit concerned that, to my knowledge, we have never really seriously invited the Chinese. I think it should be also attempted to get them involved in our thinking, in our programs. And I think doing these things jointly, firstly, gets much more benefit to all the people in all the world, and secondly, makes it, of course, financially much more acceptable to the people here in the United States.
Well, right now it seems like we're having a great deal of difficulty with the International Space Station. It's way over budget, way behind schedule. And what are your observations about the usefulness of the International Space Station and the problems we've had? Do you have any insights there that you can share with us?
Being able to do some Monday morning backtracking, I personally am today even of the opinion maybe going into the shuttle program was a mistake. We talked already earlier about the Challenger accident, where we had a big problem with one of our SRBs, with one of our solid rocket boosters. And the shuttle is such a complicated element that it is even difficult to return with the shuttle from Earth orbit. I must admit I was greatly surprised when we had the more recent shuttle accident, when the shuttle burned up during re-entry. I had not expected that. After all, we have come back from an Earth orbit with all our lunar flights, which even come back with a higher velocity than when you come back from an Earth orbit. We have returned many other payloads, and we really had never a basic problem. But the shuttle, with its huge wings, which have to be lightweight, which cannot be built from a very solid, substantial material, you have tremendous problems. And for that reason, I understand that the new plan is to go a little bit more again the Apollo way, to use a spacecraft of the Apollo type to return from Earth within the spacecraft and not with a flying vehicle, because this flying vehicle design is so complicated that I think it always will be very difficult to make it safe enough for re-entry. Now, of course, even an escape system would not save us with re-entry. So for that reason, I think the present plan that NASA has to go to a spacecraft is a good approach. It's a safe approach with the knowledge we have today right now. In future years, we might want to change it again. Of course, you will recall that even Werner von Braun, with his first moon project, which was published in Collier's magazine, he had an airplane on top of it, similar to the shuttle. And he also wanted to come back with that, not to land on the moon, because there an airplane doesn't help you. You have no air.
Yeah.
But he wanted to use it for the return trip to the Earth. And with all the new information we have today, he might even reconsider his earlier thoughts he had in that area.
Well,
So, in order to answer your question again, maybe we are a little bit on the wrong course. We have spent, of course, a lot of money. It is very expensive to launch a space shuttle safely. So, a space shuttle launch, in my opinion, costs much more than a similar Saturn V launch would have cost, with all the improvements and all the simplifications we could have introduced. So if we would have continued either the Saturn V or possibly even the Saturn 1B, which was a relatively efficient launch vehicle, we would have saved a lot of money. We could have done many of the things we did with the space shuttle, and I think we would be much better off today.
so you are not sure about whether we will ever get a reasonable return on our investment in the space station, or did we way overestimate what the space station could do? It's an ongoing program, but do you have any sense as where we are there?
Well, in a way, I'm a little bit disappointed that we have not learned more with the space station. So the payment we had to make for this relatively skimpy result from the space station, that is somewhat disappointing. And for all the money we spent over 20 years now, more than 20 years, we did not learn as much as I hoped we would learn from our space shuttle activities. And also in regard to the effect on the human being, of course with the space station we are still in the protection of the Earth, so to speak. So radiation is not a big problem yet. And when we go eventually to Mars or to other points in the solar system, we will be exposed to a lot of radiation, which we have not mentioned earlier,
Right.
which will be another big problem. And I understand that's one of the biggest problems that concerns Stullinger. And he is very much concerned, and he thinks we have to do a lot of work in that area to really have protection against the solar radiation or the radiation level you have in general in outer space. So that's another big hurdle we still have to overcome, particularly going to Mars, where we will be, even on our trip to Mars, in a relatively skimpy spacecraft for a relatively long time. We will be exposed to the solar and space radiation for many months. Going back to the moon, that is not such a big problem. You are only about a day or two on your way to the moon, and once you are on the moon, of course, you can dig yourself in, or you can have a very well-protective environment, a very protective habitat on the moon, and that would take care of this problem, at least during very critical phases where the sun is radiating relatively high levels of critical radiation.
Well, do you want to return back to the past or anything? We've been talking here about the future in space, but do you have some reflections that you might want to include along with what we did 20 years ago, if we can remember what we did 20 years ago? That some critical dimension that perhaps we didn't cover enough? Your initial experiences here in Huntsville, your initial hopes, dreams at that time?
Of course, we really did not do an awful lot on the moon. And I mentioned earlier the lunar polar regions, which have not been explored at all. So that's one next big step we have to do, hoping even to find some water there. I personally, as I indicated earlier, we should also try to utilize the moon for resources we can use on Earth. I mentioned earlier helium-3, but there's of course also another possibility that we collect the solar energy on the moon and that we pipe it down by means of radiation here to Earth. And many people have proposed to do that. Up to now, it never was shown that it would be financially efficient because our gasoline was so cheap. Now with the gasoline having already increased by a factor of about 2, and I personally see another factor of 2 in the not too distant future. All these efforts that were studied at that time and rejected for financial reasons become again quite a bit more attractive right now.
Right.
And I think we should re-evaluate these earlier studies that were made. And I personally think also on the moon there is quite a possibility that we create there and build up there all kinds of adventures which are for the benefit to the people down here on Earth. And I even understand that's the reason that the Japanese are quite a bit interested in the moon, because they, of course, have even a bigger energy problem than we have here. They have no oil at all. They have to import all their oil, and they really don't want to be dependent on all the oil nations. So they hope that eventually they can go back to the moon, and then they can import energy to Earth here from the moon. So I personally think there are a number of real good reasons to go back to the moon. I have not touched on the scientific reasons. You probably have heard, as a CT fan, that it would be very desirable to have a telescope on the backside of the moon,
Right.
where the telescope is not affected by all the Earth radiation we create here with all our radio and TV stations. And that's another thing I think we should certainly consider. Again, it's probably a relatively expensive project, and that's a typical project where I think we should invite other nations, all the nations around the world, to participate and to make contributions to these kind of scientific endeavors, which in my opinion are very important on the moon.
Yes, SETI, which stands for the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, is a subdivision of the overall space effort that's largely in private hands now. And we would dream of being able to go and put up a large telescope on the backside of the moon. But other people are dreaming of taking tourists to space. And I know you've been very much involved with Bert Rutan and some of the other private entrepreneurs who have gone into our first private flights into space. And right now we have a man taking a vacation on the space station. So where do you foresee the future of space tourism?
It's a good thing you brought up that subject. I am recently in contact with a German group. And of course, being in Germany, they have a much closer relationship with the Russian space program. And they have already with students and also with university people been repeatedly in Russia. They have seen Russian launches. They go very often to Star City in the area of Moscow. And they are planning right now to go later this year again back to Russia with a student group of about 20 people. And they get their money to support these students who normally have no money by doing much more advertising. So they promote advertising on Russian spacecraft and eventually even on American or international spacecraft. And they also think, they believe, that we should give every person in this world the chance to go into space. And maybe we could use a lottery so that you buy a ticket, and if you're lucky, you are the one who can eventually fly, in order to make the cost for the individual acceptable. On the other hand, there are apparently plenty of people, like you just mentioned, Gary Olsen, who is in the space station right now, who have 20 million in order to give that 20 million to the Russians to fly into space. And to come back to Bert Rutan, whom you just mentioned, who launched the first spaceship, Spaceship One, with purely private means into space. He also is of the opinion that we should do much more in that area. And he also would like to get many, many more people involved. And he thinks we should do that by not necessarily going right away into an Earth orbital mission, because it will be expensive. It will cost, even when more people participate, several $1 million. And there are not too many people who have that. But you can do it much, much less expensive if you just go up into space, if you make your observations there, if you enjoy the weightlessness of space for just a few minutes, and if you come back. And he's of the opinion that many, many people, hundreds of thousands of people, would be willing to pay, and he thinks he can eventually do it for $100,000, $200,000 dollars per person to go through such a venture. And you may have heard already that he is now building a bigger Spaceship One, which would not only accommodate 3 people, like Spaceship One did, which would accommodate probably around a dozen people. And of course there is a pilot and probably a co-pilot, so you could handle 10 tourists, so to speak. And even the tourists might given certain roles, what to do during their mission. And of course also during the training, they would have certain roles. And he believes that this was really open the interest in space much more. If you have this possibility to at least experience a weightlessness, you probably are much more willing to pay for a relatively ambitious and admittedly expensive space program. And he hopes that in the long run it not only helps efforts like his, and you probably know Bert Rutan is not the only one who competed for the X Prize. There were about 24 companies who see the possibility that they can build with private means, privately build and privately launch spacecraft, and that they can make some money doing it that way. And I don't even know if you are aware that this coming weekend there will be in New Mexico, close to the White Sands Proving Ground area, a reunion of these 24 people who didn't make the X Prize, and they will meet again. Some people will display their projects there, and they are not ready this year to do a launch from there, but they hope in future years, and this Las Cruces activity will be an annual affair, that in future years they will be ready and they will eventually be able to launch, and probably from the White Sands Proving Ground area, their spacecraft. And of particular interest, since we talk also a little bit about history here, it may be of interest to you that one of the projects which wants to launch people in space for financial return is a Canadian group which uses a V2. They have replaced our turbopump with high pressure tanks, but otherwise it's exactly the same rocket engine. It's a relatively low pressure rocket engine, and they hope that with their project they will be ready by about 2008 to make the first launch, and they hope that by about 2010 they might be able to commercially launch people into space. Now, since they use an A4 or V2 as most people call it, which is basically exactly the same, they of course can only handle about 3 people. So it's a relatively small spacecraft, and I think in the long run the Rutan approach is going to be more successful because he can handle about 10 tourists at that time. And of course for the Canadian effort, you always would need a pilot, a well-trained pilot. Maybe one of them would even be a fairly well-trained assistant or flight engineer, and you really carry only 1 tourist into space. So it's still a relatively expensive venture. On the other hand, as I indicated, there is a lot of interest by many people who believe that eventually the exploration of space or the movement of mankind into space will be eventually a money-making venture.
Right. We heard a lot about space industrialization back in the 70s. It seems like that might have been a premature idea of sorts, but one of the biggest industries in the world is tourism, and one of the safest places to put it, given the international terrorism scare of the present day, would be in outer space.
Yeah.
And so it would seem like that might be of some benefit there. But any other observations or final observations? I don't know how much
Of course, one of the problems is still, even if you go for safety reasons into outer space, how do you make sure that you don't always transport some of the terrorists
That's right.
in your crew? And I understand that's even today a problem down here on Earth.
Yes.
If you want to have an open society, if you have many people to come either permanently or as tourists here into the States, how do you make sure that you don't include the terrorists? And they have now the capability to look pretty much like the regular tourists. So on just looking at them, and maybe even looking at some of their papers, you can very often not determine that they are bad people, and that you should exclude them from your trip into space. You cannot even do it down here on Earth right now. So that will, and that's what I'm afraid of, will even be a problem if we go eventually with large numbers of people into space. And of course there are people like Jerry O'Neill who proposed to build big space stations in, at that time, still in a lunar orbit around the Earth. That was his idea. And he also looked at all the people who get to the space station only as good people. And he also did not have really a good method to exclude the bad people and to also bring bad people into space. And of course he had very challenging, very interesting villages in space. But what can you do in order to be sure that they stay and that they remain good and peaceful societies? And you as a sociologist might have an answer to that question.
Oh, if sociology had that answer, we'd be immensely progressive. But yes, Jerry O'Neill's space colonies seems like such an elaborate dream these days. And I can remember the night that we sat with him at the Ramada Inn here in town and talked about those ideas. At that time, I thought it was much more feasible than at this time. So, in a sense, our last 20 or 30 years of sociological, political experience here on Earth has made us realize how much more difficult it is. We have to not only have it together technologically speaking, but we have to have it together sociologically speaking. We have to have smoother, more functional societies before we can muster the energy and the resources to conquer the space frontier. So, are we about ready to?
And to come back again to our initial discussion on the space shuttle, I think again in hindsight now, the shuttle was probably be a big obstacle to do quite a bit more in the area of the Jerry O'Neill ideas, to really go into space and to build communities in space and really live with relatively large populations in outer space. We were stuck in an Earth orbit, and you probably don't want to do this kind of thing in an Earth orbit. Right. You want to go at least as far as the Jerry O'Neill orbit, which is the orbit around the moon, right. Of the moon around the Earth. And of course, with the present NASA plans, it is even going all the way to Mars, or to, they always keep adding to it, to other interesting points in space. And there are, of course, many interesting points in space. In fact, I personally am convinced, before we really go with people to Mars, we will go also initially with robots, and eventually maybe even with people, to all the meteors and all the comets which are in our solar system, and which in many cases might also lead to space utilization. The comets, I understand many of them have very valuable materials in them, and it might be good to bring them back to Earth and to recover some of that material from the meteors. So to come back to the term space industrialization, which you just mentioned, I think there are many, many possibilities. And since we are getting more and more crowded down here on Earth, and since we really need room for expansion, I personally think that's the expansion that we eventually have to go to in order to avoid the overcrowding of Earth down here.
Some people have made the case, though, that that seems to be rather hopeless. Since the Earth population grows at approximately 220,000 people per day, we would have to launch at least that many just to keep even, and that sort of technological capability is nowhere to be seen in the near future anyway. Perhaps we better learn to control our numbers down here.
And that in itself may be a good reason to go to Mars.
Yeah, that's
And
right.
to find out could we eventually popularize Mars. And I'm sure you have heard about the idea to eventually make Mars Earth-like.
Yes.
And I don't recall the term right now.
Terraforming.
Terraforming, to terraform Mars. If that would be possible, the Mars has the same area that could be populated as the Earth is.
Yes.
Because our area is mostly water. And we have only about a fifth of the total area that can be populated.
Right.
Unless we even here on Earth go underwater. And there are, of course, some efforts going on that eventually we might even live underwater. So that's another possibility. But I personally would prefer to go to Mars and to live on Mars than going underwater and living underwater the rest of my life.